Good morning, everyone. It's Ryan Benjamins here representing Lambton Soil and Crop Improvement Association. And today's road show is out to see Jonathan Zettler with Fieldwalker Agronomy. And he is demoing a field here in Lambton County to showcase the SWAT map and SWAT box for us. Jonathan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me, Ryan. So I'm out today in northern Lambton mapping with my John Deere Gator, and on the back here we have a SWAT box. So inside this unit is a device called an EM38, and that measures electric conductivity in the soil at two different depths, 1/2 meter and 1 meter. And the purpose for that is to try and measure soil texture and water movement within the field to build the maps. So SWAT map stands for Soil, Water and Topography, and it's a mapping process to delineate soil potential. So in this field over here, if you want to pan over here, Ryan, you have a bit of a topography for Lambton. I would call this pretty flat for where I'm from, but what we're trying to do is separate areas of the field and group them together based on how they behave. So all the knolls in the field get grouped together, all the depressions grouped together, and all the mid-slopes get grouped together. And then once we have that data layer, we can soil sample the field and make variable rate fertility prescriptions on that layer, seeding prescriptions on the layer, and also use SWAT water, which is a live soil water map of the field if you have a soil moisture probe in the field. And SWAT maps isn't just a map, it's also a process of crop management. You typically work with an agronomist that is the service provider for SWAT maps, and they're in the field at least twice a season typically, and doing plant stand counts and a harvest check to see what your seed mortality is and how even the crop's maturing at harvest and anything that comes out at that point. And then you do year-over-year improvement based on those observations.
That's awesome, Jonathan. So you were probably one of the first or the first person in Ontario to start SWAT mapping?
I was the first person in Ontario to start SWAT mapping. So SWAT maps was developed in northern Saskatchewan. It came out of actually a research project there. It was used in Saskatchewan for about 8-10 years prior to me testing it in Ontario and then working with it here. So I've been using it in Ontario. Now this will be the third season that it's been offered here.
Awesome. How many acres would you say in Ontario or even North America would have adopted this system through SWAT maps?
So there's probably close to 1 million acres in North America with this system. In Ontario, we're probably in that 20 to 30,000 acre range prior to the soil sample season starting this year. So.
Cool. So run through roughly how long does it take the process from someone calling you and saying I want a field mapped and sampled, or a field mapped and a script made for seeding? What's the timeline? What time of the year are you typically mapping as well?
So the majority of the mapping, probably about 80% of the mapping, happens in August, September, October, November. As the crops come off, just more window to do it, more time to work with the data and get things in place, and then the remaining 20% would be in the spring prior to the crop. As far as how long does it take, typically you can map probably about 50 acres an hour. So this farm here took about 45 minutes to an hour to map. It's about 45 acres. And after you're done mapping, the crop domestic, the owner of SWAT maps, builds the map for you, soil sample it, send the soil samples to the lab. Lab results come back, and then you can write prescriptions right away. So if you had to, could you go from mapping the field to a seeding script the same day? You could, if that needed to be. You just wouldn't have necessarily soil sample data to work with in writing it.
And in a field like this, you mentioned about 45 acres. How many soil samples do you think you'd end up taking here?
So the map is broken into 10 zones, and it's a little bit different than other zoning systems in that we group areas in terms of how they behave. So we define that ahead of time and then group those areas together. So SWAT maps always has 10 zones, and the reason for that is we group the depressions that flood together, the depressions that don't flood into a separate zone, the knolls that shed water the hardest together, the mid slopes together. So what we do then is pull 5 soil samples regardless of field size, and feel that the reason for that is we're trying to show kind of the driest areas of the field, the wettest areas of the field as the extremes, and then kind of the areas in between. And provided that there isn't a lot of spatial variability from past man-made or people-made management, it works quite well in terms of grouping those areas together. So we do a really high-resolution map from the get-go, and then that saves on sampling cost and the number of samples that you need to take.
Cool. In terms of equipment here that you've obviously got the SWAT box. Tell us about how you're getting your topography maps, or how is it all through RTK, or are you using some sort of other LiDAR imagery or something like that to collect?
The maps need high resolution elevation data, so that means it either needs to be ground-based RTK, which tends to be the case in Western Canada. In Ontario, we have found LiDAR data to use, and that's what we're currently using. So even though I have an RT-capable GPS unit on the Gator today, I don't use that as elevation data. We're using LiDAR, and part of the reason for that, it's even better resolution because it's every, say, 6 feet or 3 feet, you have a data point versus every 40 feet when I'm driving over the field.
Would you say that there is good LiDAR imagery for most of Ontario, or do you know how much LiDAR data is available for Lambton County specifically?
I don't know for Lambton specifically. There is several different sources of LiDAR data. Some of them you have to pay for, some of them are publicly available. And there's also a few projects going on within OMAF, the government of Ontario, to map some of that as well. So there is lots of sources of LiDAR data. I don't have a lot of experience specifically in this county, but we wouldn't be mapping today if there wasn't data available. So.
Excellent. Well, thank you for coming all the way down to Lambton, Jonathan, and pretty cool to see this technology advancing and moving across the province. And thanks again for coming.
Thank you for the invite.